purpose they might serve, and so on. So, the typical format with what we do here, it's very relaxed. We don't pre-script it. We don't precede any questions. It's literally, it's an informal fireside chat. But Paolo, I think we run about 24, maybe 26 of them at this stage. And it always proves to be interesting by the end of the conversation, mostly because it's not scripted. It's just a conversation.
Absolutely, absolutely. And this is, we are now live. So welcome everybody, and welcome dear guest speakers here in the Zoom studio. We are using a Zoom, a plain vanilla Zoom room for our broadcast, and we are live now on LinkedIn, and thankful for our participants who registered to watch us today. And I'm sure many more that will focus on our conversation. I will be lasting no more than 50 minutes, right, Martin? That's my timekeeper, and I'm starting the counter now.
Yeah.
So good to be here. And Martin, how we normally start these conversations? Do you remember?
Yeah, which I think you've reminded us of once or twice at this stage, Paolo. We normally like to ask our kind guests to share something with us that you may not typically share with people in this type of setting.
Go ahead. And we take a random order, like alphabetical, for instance. Isabella, maybe you go first.
Okay. I'll start by sharing something unusual about me that actually relates to the topic that we're going to be discussing. So I'm one of the last people to wear the Lenin's star, because I was born in the Soviet Union. And when I was in first grade, we were the last ones to be kind of part of that era. And of course, there's a lot of, and then, I've lived in the US for many years, and also had the privilege of living in Brazil for 10 years. So I've had a really diverse experience, both on a personal level, but this also led me a lot to think about what are the conditions at a state level, at an individual level, at a social level, that lead us to enjoy the kind of the highest potential for happiness and well-being. And in terms of the having had the experience of living in the ex-Soviet Union, not to bring about the Soviet Union as an example, but it was one of the few kind of experiments that allowed people to experiment this lifestyle that wasn't really focused on making money, right? So not that the gross economic development wasn't really, wasn't the focus at all times. So this has led me into many kind of ponderings and thinkings along my personal life and professional life. So this is something I don't often share because it is kind of contradictory, but it is, I think, something really important to have some thoughts to share on the topic. So that's fine.
Awesome. So who's next in line? Alphabetically going.
Obi, do you want to share something?
Okay. Well, it depends. Maybe the thing which could be interesting to mention here is that one of the things that I have gradually been involved in together with my wife, or maybe thanks to my wife, is that I'm a kind of specialist of Rabindranath Tagore, who is a Nobel Prize-winning poet from India. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1913, and so we do various things related to him, but in connection with what we're talking about, what we're going to be talking about. I think today he was one of the first people from in terms of philosophy to think about the impact that man was having on the environment. Back in 1916, and when he was on his way to Japan, and he noticed that there was some oil floating on the water, and then that started him off on a track thinking about how much damage the humankind was doing to nature.
Wow. One of the earliest versions of climate, well, I suppose, eco-awareness. Interesting. Wow. Paolo?
All right, so I think that I'll share with you the power of silence or the power of not being able to be in silence. So I love to travel. I've been to more than 100 countries, and the place that I wanted to share with you today is actually not a country. It's a continent. It's Antarctica, and in Antarctica, you think you think that there is silence, but in fact, there's no such thing as silence. So I spent a night camping in Antarctica, and at first you think that there's nothing going on, and all of a sudden you can listen to animals, you can listen to the ice breaking, and you realize that there is no such thing as the complete silence in nature, and that makes you think of the power of silence, or the power of the lack of silence, and how it affects your well-being, your sense of happiness, etc. So you're never completely alone, are you? So it's a very interesting perspective, and it made me think about a few things there.
Maybe that's a really interesting segue into our theme, into our whole question of well-being, wellness, happiness. I suppose the first thing that struck me, Isabella, when you mentioned happiness, and I was thinking, well, is there a difference, or is there a similarity between well-being and happiness? Are we actually talking about the same thing, or are they different elements of something maybe a little bit bigger?
Yeah, that's a question that I've always been kind of the topic for. It's a theme for my life, so to speak. You know, I studied both the micro and macro levels of that. I started out with studying psychology, and I ended up studying doing a master's in international health policy. And in looking at these different, macro and micro levels of like, what are the conditions and what are the sort of what makes us well, right? And in general, has made me kind of first segregate these different, happiness, well-being, health into different squares. But throughout my studies and throughout my life, I've ended up really finding that they're really part of the same spectrum. They're not the same, but they're really completely connected. And I'll explain why. So I've in the last 5 years, I've started my own company on wellness called Embody Wellness. And in it, I've studied the kind of how the subjective feeling of, a subjective perception of how we feel really influences our physical health and well-being, right? And there's a powerful, not just link, but it's to me, it's almost like it's a spectrum between, how I'm feeling, how happy I am and how much pleasure I am experiencing, and that translating into real well-being, both in terms of, physical health and mental well-being as well. And that, of course, there's different ways to explain that, but you can explain it through the chemical way. So the hormones that are emitted when we are feeling happiness translate into real physical symptoms, and translate into an actual chemistry that changes in our body. But there are also many, spiritual schools of thought that explain this in powerful ways. So, I think the short answer is they are very distinct, but they're completely interrelated, and we need to study them in kind of the similar field. We have to see their connections and powerful interactions, both at an individual and a state level, I think.
Yeah, we might explore that idea at state level. Obi or Paolo, thoughts on that? Happiness versus well-being, two sides of the same coin?
Well, I think they're part and parcel of the. I mean, sometimes it's a question of shortcuts that people use. Perhaps if you are happy, then people assume that your well-being is good. But I'm not sure if that really hangs together correctly. But it's the issue that. One of the things that we did recently was to go on holiday in Bhutan, and there they obviously focus on gross national happiness. But the thing that I gradually realized is that it is a well-being index. It's an example of a well-being index, and happiness is measured in kind of through a basket of all sorts of different things, which include material and non-material factors. So it depends. Well-being, I mean, I think the definition of both well-being and happiness, people struggle to put their finger exactly on this in terms which can be easily understood by perhaps more a Western audience, actually, where we're used to a particular way of thinking. For a long time, anybody referring to well-being, it was not really necessarily taken seriously. Now it's taken seriously. Yeah, it's become a big. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry around well-being, but maybe that's because there's a lot of stress, more stress than there used to be, perhaps.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Paolo, Ovi just touched on the idea there that Western culture, Eastern culture, multicultural. From your travels, having seen 100 countries up close and personal, that idea of happiness versus well-being, is there anything from a culture perspective that you might have encountered that could inform that idea?
So I'm more of a practitioner than a theoretical guy on these things, but let me bring a concrete example. Mm-hmm. Some of the happiest people that I've seen in my life were children in the middle of Africa and in the middle of South America, because they have no sense of comparison. So if all that they can compare to is what they've seen already or what they've heard, and speaking 20, 30 years ago, when there was no such thing as the internet and TV was not exactly popular in those places. Yeah. If you don't have a sense of comparison, you can be extremely happy, because the way that you compare things is vis-a-vis what you see. So the aim, the objective, even the material way of looking into your life and your existence is vis-a-vis what you know, and that's your dreams. That's how you can compare yourself to, right? And so it's very interesting that all of these things are not absolute, are they? They are relative to something, right?
Yeah.
But on the other side, if Isabel is raising her hand, but on the other side, if I go very theoretical, then 2,500 years ago, Aristotle wrote something like, happiness is the meaning and the purpose of life, the whole aim and end of the human existence. So that's quite interesting, isn't it? But he didn't write the word happiness. He actually wrote the Greek word that today some people translate as happiness, others translate as well-being, others translate as something else. So he had this concept that something like happiness, well-being, was the whole purpose of life. Then we lost it in the Middle Ages, so 1,000 years lost in this, and then it's coming back very strongly in the 21st century. So that's another historical perspective on how you want to, if you want to see this dichotomy between happiness and well-being. Sorry, I was speaking for too long here.
Not at all, no. But actually, doesn't that comparison idea feed back, Isabella, to something that you said a little earlier in terms of perception, and that idea that if we're perceiving ourselves to be different by comparison to somebody else, we might have one feeling of well-being or happiness. If we have nothing to compare with and we're just dealing with our own here and now, we might have a completely different perception of happiness stroke well-being.
Yeah, I actually, that's exactly what I was going to comment, and that I completely agree with Paolo in that the same, you know, the happiest people I've seen are, you know, not just kids, but also, you know, some of the most simple people living in like Latin America, in the, you know, some slums, and in Africa as well. And but my interpretation is slightly different, and it's also related to the comparison, but I think it's more related to you can still know and compare yourself to others and still find that happiness again. It's by kind of looking inward, right? So it's like the philosophies, the Eastern philosophies teach us that a lot, is that it's not, the happiness is not in somewhere in an external environment, and it's not to be measured by any kind of you know, how much money you have, or how you know, popular you are, or how many likes you have nowadays, right? That's kind of seems to have become the measure of happiness, but this really intangible, subjective way of perceiving yourself, and not in comparison to others, but just in absolute terms. And so I think that ignorance is bliss kind of idea is, yes, at first it starts in these you know, communities where you might not have access to compare yourself to, but many people come back, make a full circle to find that again, and how do I get back to that state of you know, innocent existence where I feel this bliss. So I think there's something about just going back to subjective states of being and not comparing ourselves, and it actually brings me back a little bit to the comparison with the way that the Soviet Union was structured. Again, not justifying anything that it did, but it's interesting because I had written a paper on it, and there's this comparison of how the values are structured when you over focus on, you know, economic productivity versus on just focusing on other values, right? So, you know, obviously in the Soviet times, you know, we received a certain X amount of money, and the focus was on other things, right? And so how that translates into the fact that time is money in countries where, you know, you constantly have to think about, every time you have a free moment, you're constantly having to think about making more money, versus if that's not the focus, then you have time to really be with yourself, be with others, and kind of tap into that quality time and tap into that inner state of bliss that we've lost. I think that's where that's where I would kind of draw the line, that it is really yeah. I don't know if I answered the question, but that's.
No, you have, but actually you prompted me to think of another relationship, and that is, so what you prompted me to think about is the cultural drivers of the feeling of happiness. And that prompted me to think in terms of our theme for today's discussion is around individual, organization, national. And I suppose what I'd put back to the three of you is the links between those three, which comes first, which comes last. What prompted me to suggest this theme in the very first place was I was intrigued about 4 years ago, when New Zealand was the first country that I became aware of that started to use well-being and wellness as some form of an input to its national measurement of its national domestic product, gross domestic product, not in economic terms, but in wellness terms. So I'd be interested in your take as to how those three elements become interlinked, interdependent, and I suppose where culture in all three elements start to inform our senses of well-being or happiness.
I can go first.
Please,
so
yeah.
2000, the creation of the American Society for Positive Psychology, that's basically the beginning of the thing, right? Mm-hmm. So that's very much individual centric. So we have over 20 years of real studies on individual happiness here, again on the Western world, as Isabella was saying. Then from an organization standpoint, what I usually claim is that the double issue from Harvard Business Review I'm just trying to get the date, if you give me just 1 second. So in 2012, which was definitely later, so 10 years later or so, you get the double issue from Harvard Business Review on the value of happiness, how employee well-being drives profits. So this is real something, because it's HBR saying there is value in corporates in taking care of the well-being of your employees. And there was a bunch of articles claiming that this is not bullshit, this is real, there's a clear connection. And now when it comes to countries, you obviously you've heard about the case in New Zealand, the case in Nepal, but there's another thing that I usually mention, which is quite interesting, that in the declaration, in the US Declaration of Independence, right in the first paragraph, you've got the reason why they are becoming independent. This is 1776. So the reason why they are becoming independent, blah blah blah, getting rid of the British, and they claim that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So right in the first paragraph of the US Declaration of Independence, you've got this word happiness, but not just happiness, the right to be in pursuit of happiness.
Yeah.
And a few years later, Benjamin Franklin was asked, so this interesting thing, we are all entitled to happiness. This is the turn of the century. And he said, no, that's not what we wrote. We wrote that people have the right to be in pursuit of happiness, but you have to catch it yourself. Now, it is so interesting that as far as I've done my little research, there is no European constitution that mentions the word happiness, not in the articles, nor in the preamble. So why is it that no European constitution, and do not forget that some of the constitution in Latin America, Africa, and even some in Asia are based on the European ones, right? So why is it that European constitutions do not mention happiness, do not mention this right to be in pursuit of happiness, do not mention well-being? Why is it that we don't think as a country that it's such an irrelevant issue that should be in our constitution, while in the US, that was written in the first paragraph of the Declaration of Independence? Is there a cultural thing here? There's something interesting going on here. I don't have the answer, but I've got this beautiful question.
Obi, have you got the answer?
The answer, but indeed it's an interesting question. But one of the things that I've come to realize is that maybe since the Second World War, there's been a lot of focus on economic growth, and there has been a link made in people's minds, at least, between economic growth and individual happiness. Yeah. So politicians tend to use the promise of delivering economic growth as being a shorthand for being able to explain to their electorates that we will deliver you economic growth and therefore you will be happy. But the connection is not necessarily that clear, I think, even for economists, between economic growth and happiness. And one of the reasons why I came into this idea of visiting Bhutan was really to do with what we're seeing to do in the connection with climate change, where, first of all, one book, which is about donut economics, mentioning that probably around that period, the idea of economics, which was originally probably more about how to apply goods and assets efficiently, whatever resources you have, efficiently, that suddenly became, particularly around the time of the Second World War, something which was really, the focus was on economic growth, and certainly the European Constitution it dates from that time, coming back to what Paolo was saying. And so probably it's from there that the focus has been much more on economic growth. But of course, donut economics also says that you cannot perpetually pursue, in the same way that in America they might be pursuing happiness, you can't really pursue economic growth perpetually.
Yeah.
And this is perhaps the reason why a more recent book, Earth for All, has been advocating that we shift away from, or we need to shift away from economic growth as a measure to well-being. And without that, they claim, there would be, we should not expect humanity to survive. Planet might survive, but humanity may not. So this is why I was curious to see what happens in Bhutan, where over, I think, 15 to 20 years, they have been, to go back to Isabella's idea of the experiment, they have been experimenting with the idea of focusing on gross national happiness and well-being rather than on economic growth, and to see whether a country really survives if they do that.
And do you know, and perhaps Isabella, you might have come across this in your studies and stuff. Do we know how Bhutan measures that wellness at national level? How do they come to a measure of it that isn't economic? Or what do they convert into an economic measure so that we can look at economic plus well-being as an integrated sum? How does that work?
The question for me?
for either Obi or Isabella or perhaps Paolo, you've come across how that measurement is done. How do we measure national well-being or national happiness?
I mean, at least from what we've seen in Bhutan, there's kind of, and I think Paul mentioned it in the event description. There were originally 4 domains, and there are now 9 areas that they look at. But going there, I think essentially they were saying this may work for Bhutan. There's no guarantee that it necessarily works for every country. So yeah. It depends very much on the culture. And I think the culture that they have in Bhutan, we tend to focus very much on the gross national happiness index, but it's kind of the next logical step from other things which are going on in their culture. One is that they live mainly in extended families. So there isn't, there's a very strong sense of community. And so they always know somebody that they can turn to for help. And there's also the Buddhist tradition, Tibetan Buddhism, which is really part of their national identity and closely connected with their government. So I think these factors, not to mention their heavy dependence on nature being in the middle of the Himalayas, I think all of these factors play into how they would define as being happiness, but it probably varies from one country to another.
Yes, it's amazing. Sorry to interrupt you, Bella. You want to say something?
Well, I want to add because I wanted to kind of add a little bit. So from the perspective of, my study at a policy level was on health policy. I was actually the first cohort to study health within economic development. So it was a really interesting view of, how health pertains to economic development and vice versa. But I think the same discussions that we had, really are relevant here. And that is, you allow things to be taken care of the economy when there is, when the for example, in terms of health, when health can really be understood by both the customers and the providers in the same way. But inherently, health is a topic that has a lot of asymmetry in information. So doctors or whoever's providing health knows much than the people, and so or the consumers. And so that ends up creating asymmetries that doesn't allow for the economy to take care of and create supply and demand in the right forms and ways. And so the government has to regulate. And I think the same really can apply to health, to happiness and well-being, because I think the idea is that, sometimes we think that, happiness can be obtained. It just happens, but it doesn't just happen, right? We learn more and more that happiness is really very difficult to obtain. So what are some of the ways that the government can incentivize happiness? Maybe it is through inverting the economic values of certain things that are not considered of value right now, like caregiving and the arts and teaching, that could potentially contribute to happiness, that are currently really undervalued. And vice versa, we value things that are not that don't necessarily bring us happiness, vice versa. And the other thing is that I think there are also a lot of spillover effects, which means that if at a government level we invest in something, and it's not just directed at the individual, but the happiness of one individual really translates into kind of collective well-being and additional improvements to the economy and society, then there is a reason for the government to intervene. And I think we can't argue about the fact that happier people equals happier societies. You would reduce all the mental health problems that we're experiencing, some of the dire violence issues that we're seeing, and from schools to I don't know. So I think a lot of the social problems that we see are really rooted in the lack of investment. So I'm the greatest proponent in bringing health into the forefront and well-being in the forefront, and working on it at a policy level. And I actually tried to do this. It's like I worked in the international development and policy at like World Bank and institutions like that for years, and then I left it because I got really disappointed in this lack of even work on like preventive health. And I went to establish my own company on well-being, and recently I went back and tried to see if I could bring the conversation of like, can we talk about well-being at a policy level? And unfortunately, there's still, there's a little bit more now about, let's talk about mental health and well-being at a corporate level, which, is improvement. So everyone would kind of say, okay, go work with the corporate level. I'm like, no, I want to work at the state level, at the policy level, not at the organizational level, because I think there's much more to be done in terms of, incentives and policies, and not directly, forcing people to be healthy, but creating the right incentive and creating the right environment. So, yeah, definitely, I think there's a big connection that we need to make between all of these lines of work, from individual to.
I think you've just touched on the third leg of our stool, which is the organization that we haven't actually touched on or discussed yet. But Paolo, from your experience, is there something missing in the corporate agenda, the corporate culture, or are we doing enough to bridge this potential gap between individual wellness, well-being, happiness, versus using measures of that at the national level to give a sense of the overall national domestic product and to take fair account of it? Is there a significant gap in that link, and should that gap be filled by organizations?
Well, it's a toughy one, obviously, but so in the same way as we've studied, or academics have studied happiness at an individual level for a bit over 20 years or 20 years, and corporates for the past 10 have been more involved into that. At national level, there isn't that much that has been studied and that you can find in literature. So it's just the way it is. Happiness is very much a 21st century Western world. Okay. And what Isabella was telling before about bringing this from personal to corporate and from corporate to country, it's still work in progress. And even before we get to country level, at corporate level, there's still a lot to be done.
Yeah.
And let me give you an example. So I'm a partner with Egon Zehnder, so with one of the leading executive search firms. One of the things that we do is that we assess leaders, right? We assess and coach leaders throughout the world, corporate leaders. When I do an assessment of a CEO, the hardest question by far, and I've done this in 4 different continents, the hardest question that I ask by far is, what makes you happy? And why? More often than not, because this is the first time that they get asked this question, which is incredible, right? Because they don't have the right amount of time and investment in self-reflection on why they are happy or why they are not happy. So what I usually get is that fluffy answer that doesn't count. So then I'd go deeper and deeper and deeper, and it's a toughy one. Okay. And obviously, if you don't think, if you are a leader and you don't think and you don't reflect and you don't take the time to analyze it for yourself, you're definitely not going to do it for your employees. Definitely not going to do it for your corporation. You have to start with yourself. Full stop. End of story. And so often you don't do that yourself as an executive, and therefore there's no way that you'll do it as a corporate level. And if you go into politics, it's even less so. So from a public policy level, the thing is just not there, right? Yeah. So for instance, what turns people happy in a corporation? Autonomy, mastery of skills, and purpose, sense of purpose, right? So okay, so sense of purpose, in the past 10 years or so, there's a lot of corporate talk about that, but how often is it just fluffy bullshitting thing? Sorry for my broken English.
Okay.
or is it really something that means something inside the corporation, right? And if I then try to extend that to the country level, how many countries have designed their own purpose, their mission statement? How many countries in the world have a mission statement? There's Finland, Singapore, Scotland, Israel. These are the 4 that I know. Okay.
And Bhutan, no?
Okay, Bhutan. So we have 200 countries, and we have, let's say, 10 that have done this, right? Singapore, some people claim that it's a dictatorship, but Singapore has done this exercise twice. The last time it involved virtually every adult on the island.
Wow.
It's an exercise that took them 2 years to do, right? So rewrite the mission statement for Singapore. It doesn't get into the newspapers. Why doesn't it get into the newspapers, right? Why is it that in our country, Paul, the 2 Paulos here, why is it that in our country we never had this sort of discussion? Why is it that the politicians never have this sort of discussion on what is the purpose of the country? What is the mission statement? Why are we here? How do we differentiate ourselves? And in fact, in the 18th century, an economist by the name of Ricardo in the UK, of Portuguese origin, a Jew of Portuguese origin, his grandparents were Portuguese. He talked for the first time about how do nations differentiate themselves, obviously from an economic perspective. But we could, as Isabella and Nobi were saying, we could take that perspective and say, what's our mission statement as a country, right? Not purely from an economic perspective, but from a well-being perspective. And we're not having this discussion.
Yeah.
Yes, but I think to be fair with Ursula von der Leyen, I think she's trying to have this kind of conversation, at least before the war. Then I think the war changed everything in terms of EU agenda. But she started to think about you know, the conversations on what is our purpose is as a union, right, in European Union. And this was mainly after Brexit, right? Brexit was like a signal to start reflecting on what we want about the EU. To be honest with, but I totally agree, Paulo, that there's definitely a lack of this reason to exist, right? And this is extremely connected to happiness. But let me ask a question here to the panel, Martin, if I may.
Absolutely. Well, yeah.
If you don't have anything, Bernie, because we are approaching our final minutes.
Yeah.
Here, because now if we are thinking about you know, the and getting this picture from Paulo, that the happiest person he ever saw was happiest human being he ever saw was these kids in Africa and South America, and this was echoed also by, I think, Isabella and Obi. If the by default state in human nature in a, you know, in a perfect world is we are happy by default, then what are the main unhappiness drivers that we could probably be identifying and trying to change, right? And this is my question for the panel, right? So what are the main unhappiness drivers that we could figure out and try to change?
Can I start with this one? Something that really very dear for me for professional reasons and personal reasons. Also, I have a 7-year-old, and you know, as I'm putting her into the educational system now, that's exactly the questions I ask myself. You know, what are the things that are going to be there that might, you know, take away from her happiness that I've so carefully tried to, you know, keep constant. I think, again, going back a little bit to what I said before, I think happiness is inherently a subjective state of well-being. I mean, there are definitely some things that are that we need in the external environment, like security, you know, housing. Some of the basic conditions, I think, living conditions are essential for us to be to guarantee our happiness at an external level. But the things that take away from our inner happiness, I think, are the distracting factors that are happening on this external environment. So taking our attention away constantly into comparisons, into quantifying our well-being and happiness by some kind of external measure. To me, that's the greatest source of unhappiness that we've created. So whether we're comparing ourselves to others in terms of how we look, how much money we make, how successful we are, and again, it goes back to, Paulo, your question. I find the same thing with my clients. The most difficult question is, what is it that you want? Because we create this whole plan and people don't really know what they want, because we are programmed from childhood to think that what we want is, the university degree, the great job, the this and that. But in reality, we never pause to think what will actually make us happy. Sometimes it's actually the opposite from it. Maybe you want to be a fisherman, live on the beach, and you don't need very much money for that, right? So it's inherently like going back to this space of, and I think if we started at the early age on, like, how do we allow kids and then adults too to tap into that question, like, what makes us happy? And that really does take some cutting away these distractions sometimes, not over focusing so much on money, on the comparisons and things like that. So for me, that's probably the worst. Sorry, let me add one more. Nature, right? There's this disconnect that we have from nature and our ability to, because nature reflects this way of just being that sometimes we're not allowing ourselves to be, like always trying to transform into something, trying to make more money, trying to do, instead of just allowing ourselves to be who we are, right? So I'll end on that note. But I think,
Obi, do you have any thoughts on the unhappiness drivers? What do we need to avoid? What do we need to eliminate here?
Well, if we knew that, then probably probably life would be a lot simpler. But I think what Isabella was saying reminded me that one of the other things that Tagore did was he developed an educational philosophy, which was really looking at the way that we deal with how instead of memorizing everything, actually being close to nature and taking a more holistic approach to all of these things. Sometimes we do things because we think, oh well, we're not supposed to be happy, and nobody pays us to be happy. We should suffer somehow in this one way or another, doing this, that, doing the other, and that's what we're compensated for financially. But somehow the whole thing doesn't really add up. If you go down that route, then the unhappiest person on earth is probably the richest. Well, I don't know. You could think of some billionaire examples actually at the moment, but there are really a lot of drivers of unhappiness. I would think that we probably all recognize in our daily work or lives. I mean, there are a lot of people who have been going through burnout, for example. I mean, why does that happen? And probably it's because there are pressures that people are put under, or feel that they are put under, that they don't see a way of getting out of. And so you may not realize that people are unhappy, except that perhaps, like Paolo, nobody has really given them the opportunity to take some time for themselves to find out what does actually make them happy.
I just would like to remind our guest speakers from some comments that we have on LinkedIn. Unfortunately, on Zoom, we are not directly connected to our comments, but Mike Cargo just asked a few insightful questions, if you may. And Martin, over to you.
Yeah, Mike is asking, he's positing 2 points to us here, actually. He's wondering whether the biggest unhappiness driver is the belief that relationships are achieved through power, whereas deep relationships are only truly secured through vulnerability, which is a really interesting thought. The second point that Mike makes is, to what extent is our own happiness rooted in loving those around us by seeking to make them happy? So we gain happiness by giving happiness, I guess. And could this mark the difference between community business-induced happiness and individual pursuit of self-happiness? There are two provocative thoughts. I'm not sure that we actually have...
So we're about time to finish this off, but very quickly on the second one.
Sure.
So it has been proven scientifically, so this is an easy one. Gratitude is the easiest way to being happy at an instantaneous level. So the easiest way to improve your instantaneous level of happiness, and this has been like studied across cultures, across religions, etc. The easiest way to increase your instantaneous level of happiness is by showing true gratitude. So by saying thank you, not thank you just because thank you, but a real deep thank you from the heart. It's to someone else. It's the easiest way to improve your level of instantaneous happiness. In fact, the person who receives it also improves the level of instantaneous happiness, but your own. So the one who demonstrates gratitude, in fact, the level of instantaneous happiness goes higher than the receiver, which is very interesting.
Yeah, and just to add to that as well, aside from the gratitude, there's also the new kind of, it's not new, but it's coming up in parenting, especially the attachment theory, which says that, without the attachment and connections to other human beings, we simply die, right? There are a lot of experiments of like monkeys who are not connected to their mothers, they don't survive and things like that. So this attachment to other human beings is definitely a big determinant of our happiness. And in terms of the vulnerability, I don't know if there are any studies on that, but I tend to agree that it's, again, that very raw connection to who you really are and what you really desire to make you happy. I think that's a difficult question for all of us, but if we can delve in and ask that question, that's the most vulnerable part of ourselves, and I think it will open doors to happiness eventually.
Absolutely. This is one of these discussion topics that we could fill a day if we had a day. We've run out of time. I think it feels like it's probably been one of the quickest conversations we've had in our fireside chats. I normally try to do a kind of a 1 minute or a minute and a half, very quick summary to catch some of the key points. So I might try that if I may. We started just discussing the idea of happiness versus wellness. And I think we broadly concluded they're two sides of the same coin. They go hand in glove. But that brought us into asking about the idea of happiness comes from relative thinking. So if you have a point of comparison, then your assessment of your own happiness may fundamentally change and fundamentally alter. I suppose that makes it a requirement then to look as much inward as outward, because if you only exclusively look outward for comparison, you may miss a whole lot of internal reasons to be or to feel happy. And Isabella, I think you made that particular point, but you also made the point at the same time that it's an evolutionary thing. It's a life cycle thing, that we don't necessarily come to that conclusion until we've been around a couple of blocks of happiness and perhaps unhappiness before we discover that we need to look equally inside as outside to arrive at our own sense of that wellness. That brought us into a discussion about culture, which brought us to a national level discussion. And then we moved into an organization focused culture. Paolo, you made two really interesting points about how we measure this. And you referred to the USA organization of psychology from 2000 that started looking at the individual measurement. And then 2010, the HBR articles that now started to look at the organizational value, economic value that can be put on wellness or well-being. That's brought us into the area of, so at national level, how might we go about measuring it? And Obi, you made reference to Bhutan's, where they have a number of key metrics. They've got 4 pillars, they've got 9 themes on which they actually try to make that measurement. I do know just from personal background reading and stuff, New Zealand has something similar. I'm just not familiar with the detail of that. That, I suppose, then brings us into, so at a national level of well-being, what can governments actually do? And Paul, you posed the question provocatively to us and absolutely bang on to say the unhappiness drivers. What might those unhappiness drivers be? And how do we avoid them? How do we stay away from them? 2 points arose there, is this sense of security. And the second thing was closeness to nature. And the final word, Paolo, I'm leaving it to your good self, in the concept of sharing gratitude. If we were to identify one thing that actually promotes happiness stroke well-being in both the giver and the receiver, it's expression, direct, overt expression and sincere expression of gratitude. And maybe that's something when we step back and look at our current society ills, maybe if we expressed a bit more gratitude and maybe a bit less expectation or belief in entitlement, maybe the wellness quotient or the happiness quotient might increase substantially. I'll leave it at that, Paul, if you wanted to round us out.
Wow, that's a round of applause, Martin, for you and all the guest speakers for this great session. We could be here for hours, and definitely now it's just the final word from every one of us here to our participants that will be LinkedIn members, managers. I mean, whoever will be watching us right now and interested to happiness, what will be your last word on this subject to them, and perhaps alphabetically again, Isabel and then Obi and Paolo.
Well, I think I just want to encourage everyone who in some way has the capacity or is involved in this, in the possibility of changing the way that we look at happiness and well-being. at policy and organizational levels to do something, to take a direction and to take a step in that direction, because I think it's, we have collectively come to the conclusion that the way that we're doing things is not really bringing us happiness and well-being in ways that we all deserve. So I think a lot needs to be done. I think that was an overarching conclusion. So just to encourage people, organizations, policymakers, to really bring that from the realm of this cute little word happiness to a serious topic of discussion. So
really good point. Yeah.
And probably I would say that one thing I really learned was in Bhutan was the importance of caring for each other and caring for nature. And this really kind of was endemic throughout the people and the communities that we saw there.
Really interesting, yeah. Paolo, final word.
Thank you and be happy. You can do it.
Yeah. Gratitude.
That's a great way to finish. Okay, everybody, thank you so much, and thanks everybody for watching. And we are going to stop our live stream